Hello, welcome to Group Six's project about Black Lives Matter and its controversial effect on society.
Black Lives Matter is a decentralized social movement that works to protest incidents such as police brutality and all racially motivated issues against Black people. The movement first began in 2013 with the hashtag Black Lives Matter on social media due to the shooting of Trayvon Martin, an unarmed African American teen. However, the real outcry and the start of the movement would occur after Zimmerman, Martin's shooter, would be acquitted in a trial. This would mean no charges would be held against Zimmerman. Since then, the Black Lives Matter movement has spread and gained enough backing and support to go from a hashtag to a global societal reform movement. Although the Black Although the Black Lives Matter movement had grown considerably since the death of Trayvon Martin and found new heights of support in the year 2020, the movement reached national headlines once more due to the death of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. Unlike Martin's death, George Floyd was killed due to suffocation by Derek Chauvin, a police officer who stopped Floyd on the road. The circumstances of George Floyd's death, specifically the characteristic of being induced by a police officer caused an uproar against not only racial inequity but police brutality as well. Other tragic deaths, such as the death of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, contributed to the movement's popularity. The movement would impact the world globally as protests started to gain traction not only in America but France, the UK, Australia, and other places. The death of George Floyd sparked a series of protests across the United States. Although these protests were for a good cause, there had been many resulting effects due to the increase in protests.
Protests began in Minneapolis on May 26, 2020, immediately after the death of George Floyd. Anywhere between 15 and 26 million people had participated, making the protests the largest in U.S. history. Widespread vandalism and looting in 140 cities led to an insurance cost of between $1 and $2 billion. Protests took place in over 55 countries across the world. It took places in countries such as Belgium, the UK, the US, and France. In 2021, the movement was honored for a Nobel Peace Prize. The movement originated in social media, being spread rapidly through hashtags and other mediums. This growth was heightened as social media became a staple in modern society, especially with the younger generation. However, BLM would only take the world stage in the year 2020, alongside the outbreak of the coronavirus. Social media allowed for a place to share videos and anecdotes of racial inequity and police brutality, which made it much easier to spread the message of reform to people who hadn't been aware before. The Black Lives Matter movement, alongside social media, revolutionized how reform movements are spread and how protests are organized. Platforms like Twitter allowed for videos to be saved and viewed from all around the world, which changed the view of many young people in society. Now the question is, has the resulting effects of the protest caused more harm than good?
So there are two sides in this argument. I will be representing the for side, which essentially argues that this side believes in the Black Lives Matters movement to stimulate moral development and reform within society. Now, there are arguments that these protests have been devastating, but this side, the side that I represent, believes that the prospect of racial equity and police reform outweigh the short-term damages of infrastructure. We also believe that we also understand that reaching racial equity in a country that is being associated with both racism and nativism won't be easily swayed. However, we also believe that any hopes of social reform will stagnate if we don't participate in activism. This stagnation would leave society in a racially biased state. We seek more than just short-term fixes, and we don't expect immediate reform, but we stand for long-term changes in both leadership and societal norms.
All right, and I'm going to be arguing as a devil's advocate for the against side of the BLM movement. So we are arguing against the Black Lives Movement, and we're arguing that the Black Lives Movement had a harmful role in society. In an already divided country, the Black Lives Movement took a firm stand against many government policies and divided the country even more between an African American and white population, and the Democrats. Whether you believe that the need for racial equality outweighs the further division of the country, we can all agree that the damaged infrastructure and the divided country did not do much for the protesters other than give them a bad name. Looking at the movement from the future, we can see that the country's division stayed stronger than ever. COVID numbers spiked due to protesters being too close to each other. Infrastructure and property is still damaged, and all the movement did was raise awareness. And that's good and all, but raising awareness doesn't mean anything if the government chooses not to act.
Question 1. Although social media spread awareness and connected to the youth of America regarding the Black Lives Matter movement, it also led to riots and properties being destroyed. Do you think social media had an overall good impact, or do you think the negatives outweigh the positives?
So I believe that the Black Lives Matter movement found its roots in is overall the positives outweigh the negatives. The Black Lives Matter movement found its roots in social media. It all started with the hashtag Black Lives Matter, appearing soon after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was Trayvon's killer. Social media allowed for not only the genesis of Black Lives Matter, but its growth as well. How is this positive? Well, as the question stated, the influence of social media caused the organization of protests. These protests have spurred many local and city-level governments to start reforms. Specifically, the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, had pledged to do more than just speak out in reaction to the protests. On June 7th in particular, the mayor released a statement that pledged to shift tax revenue from the overfunded police department to youth and social services. Money is better spent in these areas rather than the police, as it directly influences the prosperity of the future generation. Furthermore, New York lawmakers signed a bill that repealed a piece of legislation that protected police officers from hiding records and avoiding consequences. Overall, this act promotes transparency in the police force. Other states, even historically conservative states such as Texas, have banned certain techniques from being used by the police, such as chokeholds. On June 5th in particular, which followed 7 consecutive days of protests, Dallas officials changed their policies to reform the techniques used by the police force by banning any uses of force that restricts a person's airway. Now, without social media spreading awareness and promoting these protests, none of these reforms would have ever happened. We still would have been behind in racial inequity.
And for a rebuttal, I say that New York is a minority in its efforts toward racial equality. It's proven that Bill de Blasio was well known for having a terrible mayor rating approvals, and it's also proven that the Democratic Party took an opportunistic approach towards the movement and sided with the movement until people like former Vice President Joe Biden was elected to become the president. These are all proven things, and we know this. After the election results, the Democratic Party fell into the shadows and did not side with the BLM movement any longer. Without the social media's influence on the movement, people would not have gone out to violently riot. In Texas, all I will say that banning something does not stop people from doing it, especially when police notoriously forget to turn on camera in their uniforms. If social media was out of the picture, there would be less damage in an already unbalanced socioeconomic state the country was put in due to COVID-19.
Question 2. Although the resulting protests spread awareness and voiced the opinions of the American people, it led to almost $2 billion in damages. Overall, were the protests good for America?
I believe that the protests were not good for Americans and society in general for a couple of reasons. First of all, spreading awareness, like I've said before, doesn't mean anything if the government does not act on the awareness that was spread. So it's a false pro in an argument. If there's no immediate action taken, the awareness wasn't impactful. Secondly, the $2 billion did not come out of the movement's pockets. The city, state, and country governments had to pay for all the damage done to public property, and this was difficult to pay for in the declining economy due to COVID. Lastly, and more importantly than $2 billion, are the thousands of people's lives that were put at stake at these protests and riots due to COVID. These protests and riots acted as super spreader events and really helped the cases per day in the United States grow rapidly and exponentially.
Okay, well, in a rebuttal, on your first point where you said that the government hasn't acted on these protest efforts, they have. While the federal government has shown minimal involvement due to the slow partisan gridlocks in Congress, there have been many developments on the city and statewide levels. You said earlier that Texas reforms don't matter because they can still be bypassed. However, let's go back to New York, where the legislators have passed a bill that removed unfair and unjust protection from policemen. This would ultimately dissuade them from attacking brutally against defenseless citizens. In these protests, they promote an idea that will carry on past the period of quarantine. Yes, these protests have allowed the rise in COVID cases, and yes, they have caused damages. But for the fight for racial equity, it can't stop. If the fight stagnates, then more people will become complacent in societal injustices, and the infrastructural damages that have occurred serve to bring attention to the urgency of the reform that the protests yearn for. If anything, these protests are far more justified than those of anti-mask mandates, for example, which serve only to harm society, unlike the Black Lives Matter movement.
Question 4. Due to platforms such as social media, BLM inspired a new generation of youth activists. Do you think movements like BLM should serve as an example to the youth of America?
I strongly do not. I believe that it's important to get your voices heard and to be heard loud and clear. But when you risk your life and other people's lives around you, I believe that it's too much of a risk. Another reason I think it is not, and it should not serve as an example to the youth of America, is because people, there will always be violence, trespassing, and other illegal actions, and people believe that that's the only way to bring reform. That's the youth of America always look up to their parents and to the older generation, and that's how things work. And if they see how people tried to bring reform now, how will it be in 20 years? With that in mind, we will not have peaceful protests anymore, and every protest we have will turn into a riot just because of how they were taught.
I believe the contrary. These protests inspire more than just destruction to get what you want. It inspires activism and reform mindsets within the youth of America and the rest of the world. Complacency with current societal standards hampers growth and reform, both of which are urgently needed. There's a reason behind the defamation of certain public areas, some of which are Confederate statues that have only been recently taken down to these protests. Overall, these statements, while destructive, shouldn't be taken to the extremes, are necessary for the multi-layered government to take notice and listen to what the activists are saying. As for role models, if there's a role model that a child shouldn't take after, it's one of complacency. Staying at home and ignoring the racial injustices in society only serves to teach kids to be ignorant and blind to the problems that our society has. By participating in these protests, children will understand that reform doesn't come naturally, and that complacency leads to more rot in society. You say that spreading awareness is also quite useless, but without awareness, the progressive idea that will bring reform in future years will not be spread to more people in America. And without the majority, there will be no reform. So, what is Black Lives Matter effect? The debate on Black Lives Matter movement's sudden urge and support is a controversial one. Some believe that these protesters are using a facade of social reform to cause anarchy, and others believe that this is a true form of social reform that has already begun to spread awareness of the systemic biases in society. So, to leave off, what do you believe in? Do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement is transparent and promotes racial equity, or do you argue the opposite? And these are the sources we used. There's another slide.